to the University of Ottawa and to this conference sponsored by the Faculty of Law. I'm Kristen Boone. I'm the Susan and Perry DeLeese Dean of Common Law. Before we delve into these important discussions around public health and emergency preparedness, I'd like to start with acknowledging the territory on which we gather today. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à toutes les personnes autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'elles soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiennes et gardiens de savoirs traditionnels de tous âges. Nous honorons aussi leurs dirigeants et dirigeantes d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain au courage indéniable. Je tiens à remercier le Centre de droit politique et éthique de la santé de l'Université d'Ottawa qui a organisé cette conférence ainsi que les organisations qui l'ont parrainée. Le Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne, le Centre de Global Health Law Consortium, ainsi que le nouveau groupe d'intérêt sur le droit de la santé mondiale de l'American Society of International Law. C'est grâce à votre collaboration que nous sommes réunis ici aujourd'hui et c'est un honneur pour nous de recevoir un groupe de spécialistes si distingués. L'Université d'Ottawa a pris les devants pour commémorer cette occasion et elle le fait en mettant de l'avant des spécialistes qui renforcent de notre faculté le droit de la santé, le droit international et les droits de la personne. This year, in 2023, marks the 75th anniversaries of the entry into force of the Constitution of the World Health Organization, the first international instrument to explicitly recognize the right to health, and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We at the University of Ottawa are taking the lead in commemorating this important milestone, showcasing our faculty's core strengths in health law, international law, and human rights. And it is fitting that such a symposium is taking place in Canada, where two prominent Canadians played a key part in drafting both the World Health Organization's Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Dr. Brock Chisholm, who later became the first Director General of the WHO, and Professor John Peters Humphrey, who served as the first Director of the UN Human Rights Division. Their legacy is a testament to Canada's deep involvement in advancing global health and human rights. Au cours des 75 dernières années, au Canada comme ailleurs dans le monde, nous avons été témoins d'avancées inspirantes dans la sphère du droit international relié à la santé. Nous avons vu ses contours et son application se préciser. Or, ces progrès ont bien souvent découlé de grandes crises et de leurs lourdes conséquences aux quatre coins de la planète. Le mouvement pour l'accès aux médicaments était le résultat d'un long combat à l'échelle mondiale pour enrayer le VIH et le sida. Cependant, la pandémie COVID-19 nous a démontré un paralysé à travers le monde entier. Les 75 dernières années nous ont donné énormément de matière à réflexion et d'angles à analyser, comme nous le confirmerons, celles et ceux qui prennent la parole aujourd'hui. Just as important as reflecting on lessons of the past is renewing and reinvigorating our commitment to human rights and health. We are fortunate that our colleagues here today will bring this lens to the conference through looking to address global health threats that depend on the international community's collaboration and cooperation. Encore une fois, merci d'être des nôtres aujourd'hui, en personne ou en ligne. Et merci à nos exceptionnelles conférencières et conférenciers qui, dans bien des cas, ont bravé la neige et le froid pour venir souligner ces anniversaires et notre campagne. Je vous invite tous et toutes à tirer pleinement de ce que notre ville et notre campus ont à vous offrir. It's now my pleasure to pass the podium to Sophie Nunnally, Acting Director for the University of Ottawa's Center for Health Law, Policy and Ethics. She's also a 2023-2024 AMS Fellow in Compassion and Artificial Intelligence. Her scholarship takes up issues of health law and human rights with a particular focus on mental health, legal capacity, decision-making, and the regulation of health-related artificial intelligence. Sophie.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. My name is Sophie Nunnally. I'm the acting director of the Center for Health Law Policy and Ethics here at the University of Ottawa. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you, those both who are here in person and online, to the symposium Advancing Health Justice in a Turbulent World, commemorating 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the World Health Organization. So just a moment about the mandate of our center. It's really to act as a hub to bring together voices across different disciplines and different kinds of scholars and practitioners. And the premise is really that we can't address difficult issues of health policy in any particular silo, that we have to bridge those gaps and collaborate. And so we have about 30 core faculty members drawn from faculties across the university, about a dozen different disciplines. And so it's in that spirit of bringing different voices together that we are co-hosting today's event with some really wonderful partners. We are co-hosting with the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Center, led by Professor John Packer. The International Commission of Jurists Canada, which is an organization that promotes international human rights and the rule of law throughout the world. The Global Health Law Consortium, which is a new collaboration started in 2019, which is aiming to analyze the legal implications of global COVID-19 response, as well as future legal standards for global health governance, and the American Society of International Law's Global Health Law Group. So all of these partners were really critical to bringing this day to you. I also want to acknowledge that important financial support that was really crucial to making this happen was provided by the University of Ottawa, the Faculty of Law, Common Law section, and the Human Rights Research and Education Center. So thank you for helping to make this event possible. And of course, I want to recognize the really important work of Professor Regine Habibi. She led the organization of today's event. She joined the Faculty of Law here at the University of Ottawa quite recently, and we're really, really fortunate to have her dynamism and expertise. Professor Habibi is an expert at bringing, bridging the fields of international law, health law, and human rights to address global health law, global health issues in a really impactful way. So thank you, Regine, for spearheading this day. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Giles Holland, who is our center coordinator. He really did a lot of work in making this day possible, as well as the Global Strategy Lab's Demetria Choutouros, who took a leading role in communications, and to the law students who helped out today. We're volunteering. Now, what is today all about? As you know, it's the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the WHO. But we're also at a unique moment in history. We're grappling, as everyone knows, with the aftermath of a once-in-a-century pandemic. And so the premise of today is that this is also a really good moment to pause, to stop and take stock, both on the progress that has been made on linking human rights and global health, but also an opportunity to reflect on what more can be done and how do we best prepare for the future, ensuring, for example, a human rights informed approach to global health threats, including future pandemics. So I'll just give you a really quick rundown of what today will look like. In a moment, I will introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Alicia Eli-Yaman, who will be presenting on her acclaimed Stanford University Press book entitled When Misfortune Becomes Injustice, Evolving Human Rights Struggles for Human Rights and Social Equality. We'll also have commentary from Professor John Packer. We'll then have a short 15-minute break, then move to a panel discussion on strengthening pandemic preparedness and response through global health law reforms. We'll have an hour for lunch, and then we'll kick off our afternoon with our second keynote speaker, Professor Benjamin Mason-Mayer, who will speak about human rights challenges in global health governance, advancing human rights in global health law reforms. We'll then have another break and a final panel reflecting on health and human rights in the next 75 years. So we'll have an opportunity to look forward and think about what's coming. Professor Habibi will close the event at 5 with some concluding remarks. So I'm not going to take any more of your time. I do want to just say that you can invite your colleagues to join as well by live stream. I don't know if we can put a link up first, but you can access the link through the Global Health Law Consortium website. Is that right? Through the Twitter account. So I'll turn it over to our first keynote speaker, who is Professor Alicia Eli Yamin. She teaches law at Harvard Law School and Harvard Medical School, directs the Global Health and Rights Project at the Petrie-Flom Center at the Harvard Law School, and serves as senior advisor on human rights and health policy at Partners in Health. She has over 30 years of experience in human rights practice, living and working with advocacy organizations across the globe. She regularly advises constitutional and high courts and has served on numerous UN and WHO expert groups and committees, including being appointed by the UN Secretary General as one of 10 international experts to the Independent Accountability Panel. I'll just quickly also introduce our commentator, Professor Packer. He's the Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution here at the Faculty of Law. He is also director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center. He's held previous academic roles at the University of Essex and the Fletcher School, Tufts University. With fellowships at Cambridge and Harvard, Professor Packer has lectured globally, published extensively, and also sits on several NGO boards. He spent 20 years also in practical contexts with intergovernmental organizations investigating human rights violations. He was previously director of the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities in The Hague, and he recently served as constitutions and process design expert on the UN standby team of mediation experts advising on peace processes, diversity management, and human rights protection. So we are in very good hands with these two seminal experts in the field. Thank you for joining us, and I will turn the floor over to Professor Yamin.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I'll just wait until Regine gets up the PowerPoint. It's really a great pleasure and privilege to be included in this amazing event. And a very special thank you to the University of Ottawa and the multiple centers for enabling this to happen, and also to Professor Regine Habibi for the invitation and the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about my latest book. I'll start with saying that this is actually the second edition of this book. I was incredibly grateful to the editor-in-chief of Stanford University Press, who the first edition came out literally days before SARS-CoV-2 was declared a public health emergency of international concern. And very shortly before it became a pandemic, everything shut down. And so when Stanford University Press came to me and said, would you like the opportunity to revise the book in light of lessons of the pandemic, I, of course, jumped on that. And what this second edition turned into was not just adding a chapter at the end, but was really gave me an opportunity to rethink and weave through arguments throughout the first edition of the book. Can we just project? Oh, fantastic. So I actually want to go back to, I want to go back to when I was writing the first edition, because many of the central arguments are exactly the same. If anything, they're more strong now in the second edition. Because before the pandemic, we were already in an era of polycrisis, right? We were facing evident climactic crisis around the world. The US pulled out of the Paris Accords. We had more and more dire warnings from the UN that we were not going to meet the 1.5 degrees change. There were gaping social inequalities staring us in the face in every country in the world. And Oxfam had started its reports on global and national inequalities. We saw in front of us the effects of decades of neoliberalism and in terms of underfunded and privatized health and other systems that turned out to be catastrophic during the pandemic. And we were facing a crisis of liberal democracy, this wave of conservative nationalism and populism. Again, this was in the aftermath of Trump's election, Brexit, then there was Bolsonaro, there was Orban and Erdogan and Duda in Poland. And the focus I put on this is not so much on demonizing the conservative nationalists and populists, but looking at why the institutions of liberal democracy had betrayed, had let down civilians, and had not complied with the promises made for improving material conditions of life. And also the multilateral order was clearly not fit for purpose. I mean, there were already grave complaints against the UN. Guterres was talking about a loss of trust in multilateral institutions. There was already complaints about the IMF and the growing wave of austerity and debt. Global governance for health was especially subject to scathing critiques for being hollowed out by philanthrocapitalists and corporate interests in these global health platforms that are deeply problematic. So that's where we were before the pandemic even began. And now I want to talk about how did we get there and how did we get here and what has the pandemic changed? And give you a little bit of a sense of the book. And when I say how we got to where we are, the book adopts a temporal format over approximately the last 50 years, and each chapter talks about a different country and has stories in it to show that many of the decisions that were taken were not inevitable or inexorable. And they can be changed. The situation we find ourselves now in was carefully constructed by a number of different powerful actors, and it can be deconstructed. It's also a particular story from my perspective. I subscribe to Pierre Bourdieu's view that a knowledge that presumes that it is omniscient and comes from nowhere produces in readers and students a knowledge that is ignorant of its own limitations. I don't think there's any exercise in constructing the history of a specific field that is free from biases and power relations. So this is a story that is told from my particular positionality. It's also a synthesis across multiple fields. It's not just about the march of human rights law, because really, I think to understand what is most important about what has happened lies in the interstices between these fields, human rights law and medicine, economic paradigms, etc. So it makes a big effort to connect the dots, not necessarily for people who are already converted or for experts in specific fields, but again, pedagogically to allow students or lay people who are not involved deeply in one of these fields to have a sense of how things fit together. And I use firsthand experience. As was said, I've lived all over the world and worked with local human rights NGOs in many, many countries. I grew up between South America and North America, and much of my human rights advocacy has been in Latin America, as well as in East Africa and other places. So I use stories and I weave them together, and I'll just give you a very small flavor of what that is like, because each chapter begins with an anecdote and ends with another anecdote. So this one is, as images of bodies lining the Ganges, mass graves in Brazilian favelas, and makeshift morgues in New York flowed across our large and small screens during the first years of the pandemic, along with a daily saturation of numbing statistics. Even those not visited directly by the Grim Reaper were forced to contemplate whose deaths are grieved and why. Grief and mourning are not the same. We mourn many public figures whose obituaries elide episodes of their fecklessness. We take note, if not mourn, the passing of the masters of the universe who tried to defy the myth of Icarus. We mourn the soldiers, often in the prime of their lives, who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Grief, as opposed to mourning, is a private affair reserved to those for whom the absence of a person leaves their inner worlds shattered. Sometimes, however, in the very saddest of cases, neither grief nor mourning are to be found in the shadow of loss cast by a death. Blame, shame, and recriminations, or merely indifference, fill the space that a human being used to inhabit. The death of Paula Arisanca Barrientos, who was 35 years old when she died in childbirth, was one of those cases. And then it goes on to talk quite in depth about what happened to her and to connect it to what was going on in the country and in the world at the time. And these are pictures. This is a case, obviously, that I investigated. This is in the Peruvian Altiplano. It's called the Putuco, this structure made of adobe. The structure helps keep the warmth in, and this is where indigenous women go to give birth. It's where her mother, Pablo's mother, died in childbirth. It's where she too died in childbirth. And this is her husband at her grave. So the first, I'm going to share with you some of the major arguments I make, and hoping, because much of the book is in dialogue with many of the people in this room and some of the people who are online, and hoping that it will provoke discussion and conversation, because I'm really eager to hear from you. So the first major argument is, how effective has it been to use human rights to advance population health and population health equity? And I argue then, when we started out, and that was another period of radical transition at the end of the Cold War, when Nelson Mandela was walking free from prison, and it was the end of apartheid. It was a really extraordinary time that when we started out, we faced three major obstacles. One was subverting entrenched ideas that health and other socioeconomic rights were not real rights, but mere programmatic aspirations. And there, I think we have achieved an awful lot. The right to health is justiciable in very many countries around the world. I think including low-income countries, I think that the challenge has changed now to show that we can judicialize health and health-related rights in ways that advance health equity across systems, and to manage complex adjudications that involve multiple levels of government as well as private actors in ways that preserve the democratic legitimacy of courts, but also catalyze effective action by the democratic organs of government. The second challenge, I argue, was articulating what it means to take health-related rights seriously, not just in laws, but in public policy and institutional practices. And that, I don't think, is self-evident. I mean, even during the pandemic, we saw how diverse human needs were during COVID-19. And of course, containing COVID-19 is not the same as advancing a right to health. But again, I think we've made considerable progress in this regard. We have principles and criteria around the so-called human rights-based approach to health. Again, I think the challenges have evolved. Now we need to make sure that those human rights-based approaches to health are not tick box exercise mainstreamed in global institutions to be carried out by bureaucrats at national level that don't actually change structural subordination in health or beyond. Challenge that at least all of us, when I was in law school, a group of friends founded what would later become the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And this is certainly what we were thinking, in addition to focusing on the abuses in US foreign policy at the time. We thought that demonstrating that advancing economic and social rights, and in my case, health rights, could achieve meaningful progress toward more egalitarian societies could diffuse economic power the way civil and political power had advanced democracy and more just global orders. Well, that I think we have fallen short on, right? Because socioeconomic inequality has vastly increased across countries across the world at this period, and predictably, the people who are left low on the social ladder have suffered. But more than the increase in inequality, it's this. It's that private wealth, private capital has increased dramatically in these last 40-some years, whereas public capital has decreased. Of course, public capital is what we use to invest in health systems and public health, to invest in education and public housing and infrastructure, to materialize human rights. Whereas private wealth redounds to the benefit of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Bill Gates, etc. Yes, there are public-private partnerships. I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer session, but primarily this vast concentration of economic power. The argument I make throughout the book is that it has deformed our political processes and our political institutions, and has in fact colonized our collective imagination about what is socially possible. Now that is happening in the North and South alike, but if you step back and look at the globe as one, you can see enormous drain of resources from what I'm calling the global South to the economic, right? It extends far beyond what we often talk about as official development. It's far, far, far deep, right? In Africa alone, Africa is exceeded by the resources that are drained by over $40 billion. So what is this? This is obviously debt, a lot of payment on interest, by the way, not the residual capital. It is unequal terms of exchange, what are called transfer pricing practices. Some of that multinational tax evasion is legal, but some of it is illegal, right? So that is also a huge flow out of the global South. And intellectual property is a massive transfer of wealth from the global South. Trade and investment agreements and suppress wages and costs. So the story is one of duality. Of while we were building the architecture of a new human rights framework, seeding norms, building institutions, obtaining precedents, expanding the number of groups and populations who could be considered full, equal citizens, women, children, LGBTQIA populations, persons with disabilities. This was going on and limiting the capacity and the deliberative capacity as well as resources to materialize, to deliver on those rights. And that's very much that reality is what I'm. So starting from the very beginning of human rights, we're here to celebrate the birthday or the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and vision, the faith in multilateralism that the post-World War II order embodied. But actually, and I do not gloss over, I'm not one of those people who says, oh, the secular natural law, that's entirely ahistorical and problematic given tendencies for human rights principles now. But most of the focus is on, yes, there is the United Nations, yes, there is the CDHR, but there was another multilateralism that was considered equally important for peace, justice, and security. And that was the multilateralism organized under the Bretton Woods Institute, the World Bank, the IMF, the Paris of Trade. And those two multilateralisms took very divergent courses over these last 40 years. And that explains quite a lot. Development, human rights was confined to the relationship between a citizen and her state, while economic development in the mainstream was the relationship between countries. That was not inevitable. There were other proposals. There were other arguments about structural dependency in development. But because of a variety of factors, largely colonialist and neo-colonialist interests, that's what happened. A similar division occurred between civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. One being, advanced by the US and Western Europe, the other by the former Soviet Union and some other countries. Was that division inevitable? No. But again, it was a factor of the Cold War politics and the dominance of the United States. A third division, which is in some ways a factor of the construction of the liberal state, to be drafted into international law, was that between public and private. So the abuses that took place in the Argentine civic military dictatorship of torture and forced disappearance, extrajudicial execution, arbitrary detention, committed directly by state agents, those were human rights abuses. But the violence that was committed in individual homes, the domestic violence, the allocation of resources and control over bodily autonomy, those things were not considered human rights issues at the time. And those things, I argue, disproportionately affected women. So feminists from Argentina and Chile were among the pioneers to argue that you have a real democracy if you have dictatorships within each house with entirely different governments. And now we have seen eroded all of these essentials, I believe, to some extent. We see now, for example, in Argentina, the symbol of the mother, grandmother with the white person, the mother, essentially, has morphed, where the symbol of the person is the symbol of hope, of democracy, and what democracy meant under that dictatorship has morphed to the neo-menos movement, which is against femicide and gender-based violence, and the green wave. That is a huge transformation, and it transforms not only ideationally what human beings can expect, what they think is necessary for them to live lives, but also what they expect of their state. What a democratic state of law owes to the people, its citizens, right? And in this case, in the Green Wave case, it is a health system as a fundamental social institution that needs to guarantee life-saving services to half of its population. That is part of what democracy means today. So throughout, I'm interested, that's the origin, but I'm interested in this duality. So, for example, in the 1990s, we had these magnificent transsectoral UN conferences that brought, for example, feminists from the South who were more interested in the poverty, feminists from the North who were more interested in reproductive autonomy, but groups of people from around the world converged conferences that produced extremely important conceptualizations that then played out across rights and called for institutional political. At the same time, we had transformative constitution, which has been immensely critical for the advancement of health rights in particular and economic rights more broadly. But during that same decade, we have a deepening of more waves of adjustment, the establishment of the WTO in 1995, fighting enforcement power and calling for different national governments internal legislation regarding intellectual property. And all of that also had an effect at the national level. There was a synergy between autocrats and this neoliberal alignment of policy. So I was living in Peru for much of the 90s, where you could see the arrogation of power to the executive branch in the name of state modernization. Sometimes they said national security, who at the time had a insurgency going on. And that allowed Fujimori, in his tremendous autocracy, to implement a dramatic health reform using almost 1,000 trees, not passing to Congress or via Congress, not having democratic deliberation, but really a synergy between growing autocracy at the national level and these pulling the purse strings from international institutions. Argument I make, and I won't have time to go into depth here about this, but I'm happy to talk about it, is how to create progressive change. And it is not the view that human rights operates top down and social justice activists go from bottom up. It's quite a bit of a more messy, as I said before, recursive relationship between different actors, and it's dynamic. It's dynamic and it's experimental in many ways, because you're not exactly sure what is going to happen. But it relies on norms in international law, often in the realm of health, changes in paradigms in public health, different conceptualizations, organizing by women's movements. These made it possible to come together to define core obligations related to maternal health and preventing maternal mortality, defining policies and public policies in the context of that. Again, here, different actors were engaged, including the Human Rights Council. All of this happening at a time when there's supposed to be legal translation of what these big sort of concepts in the meetings, even in general comments and general recommendations, mean to people on the ground in their real embodied lives. And that then feeds up again to the committees, it feeds into jurisprudence, into what happened in the Aline case, which is a landmark case in international human rights law, finding for explicating intersectional discrimination. Aline was young, she had during the education, she was poor, she was Afro-descendant, obviously she was a woman, imposing an obligation on states to surveil and regulate private institutions, health institutions, really for the first time in international human rights law, and calling the lack of emergency obstetric care as affirmative entitlements to emergency obstetric care. So those findings, in turn, and this can happen in other ways, but those findings in turn change, reframe what was going on. Aline didn't die because of just a lapse in quality of care. If you had the ministry, some independent ministry of health, and left it back to the ministry of health, they could have fixed those lapses of quality. And I've seen this in so many capabilities here. But this was a change. The death is not a lapse of quality of care. It's a violation of fundamental freedom, a violation of freedom. And because it had gone to the CEDAW committee outside of the bill, that automatically changed. So no longer is it just up to the Ministry of Health to provide it. It's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that has to provide it. It's the Ministry of Justice that has to provide it. The Ministry of Women and Social. And Brazil did actually take this interministerial committee with the Ministry of Finance and Health and all the governments on it after this case. It also creates new coalitions for mobilization and advocacy. Sometimes we forget exactly really what it takes to implement this. move forward. Creation of these new coalitions, new social discourses, not just a positive point in law. So what did the pandemic do now that we're on sort of the other side of it? Well, I think many of us have already written about the marginalization of health regulations, the idea that more states impose additional measures out of a sense of precaution rather than following scientific principles. I think we talked about marginalization of human rights law as well. And the pandemic absolutely brought it to our focus certainly in international human rights law and in monitoring accountability systems there. It also, in my view, showed the importance of political culture. In many, many cases, it was more predictive of whether a country would engage in massive rights violations. Look at that country, and see whether they derogated right? So, or declared state of exception. Poland did not declare a state of exception, but moved very far toward it. Hungary did declare a state of exception with so much constitutional and also moved very far. And the infrastructures for delivering. Helen Clark and the independent panel emphasized this, that the countries that fared better during COVID had more flexibility so that people could stay home from work, so that people could shelter without getting all of their family members sick. So the health system was not on the verge of collapse. So the infrastructures for delivering on rights seemed to me to have enormous significance that we had somehow left aside somewhat in our focus on building up the normative scaffolding. It was shocking, I think, to me, the extent of unfettered need that occurred during the pandemic. That while people were being, hundreds of millions of people were being thrust into poverty, losing livelihood, losing houses, others were being minted as billionaires. And that there was no sense of enormous shame and outrage about that shocked me as well. And I think that poses a whole nother set of problems that I'll come to. And I think the foundations of global governance for health revealed as the profoundly colonialist foundations that they are. Not just the incredible, disastrous negotiations over the TRIPS waiver, but also the debacle of COVAX and that the complete ineptitude of multilateral development banks in playing their role in trying to cushion some of the effects of the pandemic, the lack of issuance of special drawing rights by wealthy countries in the north to help countries in the south recover. It has all been an absolute mess, to use a very technical term. So now I want to turn, before going to the conclusions, I want to turn to some of the questions we put on the human rights principles of public health, which is really what we're going to talk about later in the day, but is related to the broken rights. One of the things that was very important to me to establish those principles as we were participating in the process for November is to focus on what for during public health, so-called ordinary. You can't fix robust and resilient health systems and infrastructures for greater support of determinants when an emergency is over. And I think we learned that. I also think that, along with my colleague at Harvard, Sheila Gessner, trust. We saw all around the world so important how different countries fared during the pandemic also is not something that we build during the emergency. It has to be happening before you. There are very multiple for lack of trust in your health facilities. And that has to be addressed in so-called ordinance. As Jasmine says, it is in the realm of politics that trust in relations are built among states, between citizens and states, and among states. And those collisions are then in turn motivated when the public is asked to follow recommendations to advise the states of their delegated authority. But the analytic starting point has to be within national policy and not just in the technocratic domain of health and safety. Thing that was very important on the public health emergencies was this idea of meaningful and effective one of the. I think we all saw that during the pandemic, the advice of experts and experts and epidemiologists, the IHME were wrong as often as they were, and often left out. But that is true even during so-called ordinary times, right? Again, the health system is a social institution. How you move toward universal health coverage, those are normative. Those are not technocratic Europeans. Those are deeply fundamentally normative. The health itself is very unstable. It's unstable because of empirical factors. 5 years ago, we didn't know what COVID-19 was. It's unstable because of the advent of technologies. It changes what are the appropriate measures to take. We didn't have Paxlovid, for example, a couple of years ago, and on and on and on. It's unstable because of changing demographics as well. But there's also a lack of normative consensus. How much priority do we give to the worst off in society? The worst off socioeconomically, the worst off in terms of clinical conditions. How much priority do we give to keep all people having fair chances, or to maximize health? And a number of other priority setting problems that are unresolved and require people to participate in these processes. That they deserve to have policies in health justified to them, just as policies in other areas of law are justified. It is part of a democratic society. A lot of work has been done. I've been very privileged in a variety of WHO panels on health benefit packages, health technology assessment mechanisms, even financing proposals. And there's now quite a consensus around evidence-informed but deliberate priorities. And I think human rights and more human rights people have a lot to contribute in the development at national level. So the final point is, which I don't think obviously the principles could resolve these questions, but these are conversations about the process, and these are conversations we've all had during the course of the pandemic and long before, as I said before. So how do we understand global health justice? The Dahlgren and Whitehead things flowing about health inequalities that are avoidable, unfair, and unnecessary, are unjust, doesn't really help us with these global health problems, right? So, and this is something from Public Health 101 and Global Health 101. We often look at this as, well, the vertical line, they're in the same GDP per capita, so they should be able to change policies and move upward. Yes, it's income. So this might require international assistance. And I don't believe that story. So there absolutely is domestic injustice. Afghanistan is down here because of the way treats its female population, among other things. There are other countries we could show that also have tremendous domestic injustice, and therefore their overall outcomes in health are lower than other countries. But there are other reasons as well, and how we can consider what is domestic injustice versus injustice is domestic related to other factors at the international level. There are inequalities in other conditions that affect health, which again, I don't think are exclusively limited within borders. Malawi is a landlocked country, which has created nothing of the global climate change problem, and yet it has been by 3 lifetime hurricanes in the last few years that have wiped out health systems. We have international norms and practices, which is what I've emphasized, the tax regimes, debt justice, all of the international property that affect how these countries can use their resources, if they have control of their fiscal and monetary policies, and where they stand in this overall graph. And then, of course, we have changed history, which I think is complicated. I think it's complicated to piece together how you actually establish reparative justice for the innumerable crimes we have committed against populations within our countries as well as out. Nonetheless, I don't think it is possible to look at a global health justice moving forward without some measure of reparative justice, whether that starts with loss and damage funds and climate finance or otherwise. I think not looking back, pretending of the historical amnesia is actually a way that we cannot possibly create global justice moving forward. So here I'll wrap up. These should not be surprising after the talk. I really emphasize in the book the importance of infrastructures for the effective employment of rights. Yes, building normative scaffoldings, seating standards, absolutely important. But we need to focus equally or more so on the infrastructure, social and material infrastructure, delivering on rights. We should target inequality, not just poverty, going back to one of the first slides, accepting that we need to develop core capacity funds or something like that, buys into this narrative that there isn't more money, that there is scarcity. And that's just not true. There's more money in the world today than there's ever been. It's just not distributed appropriately. And distributing appropriately requires challenging these rules, challenging tax laws. And these are things that are all happening. I'm not inventing them. I work for an NGO called Health. We are part of coalitions that are working on tabling a UN tax convention with the African group that would tackle some of the gross abuses of multinational taxation. We are part of another coalition working on debt justice and a very specific campaign in the state of New York to pass legislation that would block the so-called vulture fund. Champerty and vulture funds that come in, swoop in, and try to extract great profits out of sovereign governments that have defaulted on their debt. And development finance, which again was a huge debacle during the pandemic, and appears to continue to be a debacle, with now more governments saying that they are going to put facilities together based on private guarantees, et cetera, instead of giving more long-term public investment that is democratically governed by more countries instead of this obsolete charity notion of rich countries to poor countries, where poor countries have no say about where developments assistance goes. I emphasize throughout that we need research networks across disciplines. I like very much the introduction to this event because that is my view. I think that drawing walls around our little siloed fields is not going to produce the kind of performance we need to work across disciplines and across borders. It's no longer possible to work on health justice without working on climate justice. It's no longer possible to work on climate and health justice without working on debt justice. It's no longer possible to work on climate justice and promote electrical vehicles to the north while not realizing the sacking of indigenous lands in the south to take the So my message is that collectively across disciplines, across borders, as daunting as the situation that we find ourselves in, and I do think it's daunting. I don't mean to be describing a recipe or overly Pollyannish. I think the challenges today are visible. But working collectively together, and especially to the young students who may be here and maybe watching online, this is your opportunity to identify the challenges that are facing you in these intersecting crises and to move forward. And I keep saying collectively because this is going to require more than denouncing and naming and shaming. It requires building collective power and organizing. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's difficult to follow such comprehensive and remarkably integrated presentation. So much to talk about. Let me also say that we probably don't have much that we disagree upon because I normally, I nod in concurrence, but maybe there are nuances. Nonetheless, I'm honored to be invited to share some comments, some reaction. Thank you, Professor Habibi, for organizing and inviting me. Also to colleagues in the Center for Health Law, Policy and Ethics. Let me also, by the way, say it's nice to cooperate with our centers. And also we're missing a banner here. Professor Mendes and I were trying to find, even late last night, where the heck is the banner for the International Commission of Juris Canada section. There is one, we'll find it at some point. But another important partner in this, particularly on the justice questions. A couple quick remarks about the approach, which is hyper interdisciplinary. I think we all probably grasp that. This is comprehensive in analytical terms, makes it somewhat difficult, and therefore, I'll try and thin it down for digestion purposes a little later. I'm going to steal from something you did before, Professor Eliaman, as a little model that we can kind of get our heads around. But allow me a few kind of prefatory remarks. Your second edition, of course, was written after COVID, or as COVID-19, almost simultaneously as this was emerging. And, I think a lot of us have said there's a kind of blessing in COVID-19. Of course, it wasn't the first pandemic. We had lots of pandemics. But it drew back the curtains on some things we kind of felt or knew about. I'm going to come back to one of them in a moment. You used the term financialization in your writing. I want to talk a bit about that also in the Canadian context, because I'm always been persuaded by this thing, follow the money, because I think we're probably all told there's a money problem, we don't have enough money, or where do you get the money, and all the rest of that. I want to come back to that because this is a very important point in all of this. I also want to say something about the approach you take, which is the scholar activist, or some people say the pracademic. And so forth, but to be informed. And I know that persons who inspired you and you worked with closely from, of course, Paul Farmer, but also people like Jonathan Mann and many other, David Petrasek, who was a colleague of ours. And those of you who might not know David Petrasek, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a professor in the Faculty of Social Science. Yeah, a lot of people who had to combine this richness of professional engagement and practice also with thoughtful reflection and academic work. And Thinking back on the Center for Health and Human Rights and also the Francois Bagnon Center at Harvard School of Public Health, when Jonathan Mann established it, the first issue of the first journal in, I think, 1994 or 5, but the first or second article was written by a former colleague of mine, Virginia Leary. And the reason I mention her, she wrote the short piece, like 12 pages on me about health, the right to health and international human rights law, is her professional experience, which many might not know, was not health. It was labor. She was a lawyer in the International Labor Organization, where I was privileged to be a colleague of hers for a short while, and bringing a kind of rigorous approach. But for those who know the ILO, it's a very practical organization, and it engages through its tripartite approach. It's not just top down. It has labor present at the table in terms of participation, of course, employers and also governments. And, you know, I don't know how many recommendations and conventions and so forth. It's over 200, I think, now. But they're very precise, and they're implemented through precise systems of implementation. And I think, I know that Professor Leary, who later taught at University of New York, Buffalo, was trying to bring that same approach to health and saying, you know, this is a huge, another extraordinary person. So there's a line of these people, and you're definitely, you know, following in that tradition. I want to mention a word or two also just about, even if I read the structure, I love the first word of the first chapter, indignation and injustice. And what rings in my mind is John Lewis's Good Trouble. And I think, you know, because if you work in this field and you're on the ground and you look at victims in the eye, you meet people who are suffering. I don't know how you're not indignant. I'm pissed off, very frankly. And I'm told by psychologists that the correct response, you know, in such situations is anger. So we should not be angered about this. We should actually be more than indignant. We should be mad as hell, because there's a lot that's going wrong here that we need to change, and we have the capacity to change, which is we need to make certain decisions around it. In your final chapter, you switch a little bit. You talk about the we, and here I think is part of the problem, because I don't think we have a we. I don't think the global, our imagined ideas and aspirations about the global community and so forth, I don't think it's there. I think there's a lot of deep division. We pretend a bit. A lot of conferences and so forth. I think there are really deep divisions, and the extractive, exploitative aspects of the prevailing systems are actually contrary to that idea of we. It's actually us and them. And we need to really overcome that, because if you just mentioned about climate change. And I don't know that you use explicitly the terms, but you basically are framing in the context of complex interdependence. And our world is increasingly complex and increasingly interdependent. And it's not just about pandemics. You know, I don't know if anyone in the room knows what the first Asian contagion was. It wasn't bird flu. It was the sudden precipitous drop of the Thai baht, the currency of Thailand. Within 24 hours, it dropped precipitously, and global currency exchanges rippled within 24 hours. We can't escape it. We are intertwined in all sorts of ways globally. Of course, climate change tells us that. We see it in our streets and in our environment and so forth. Pandemics, as we say, most recently drew back the curtain. But there are many, many more. Conflicts, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and what are we talking about? Export of grain and food insecurity, and hundreds of millions of people, probably substantial millions of people who are going to die of starvation in places nothing to do with Ukraine-Russia violent conflict, and don't care about it, but they're going to pay the price, the suffering that's going to. I mentioned currencies, a Thai baht, but just to get a sense of this complex interdependence, what the heck is cryptocurrency? I mean, that's got nothing to do with the Westphalian paradigm. Money or currency was a state prerogative. Either they printed a convertible, they didn't print, they coined something convertible or exchangeable, or they create fiat currencies. But it's the state and it's a fiat. What's a cryptocurrency? We're now living in a world that is outside the Westphalian paradigm. But there are those who use the Westphalian paradigm for continuing extractive purposes. And I think this is, we have to be very conscious of. So I want to commend you for critiquing charity. Enough of charity. This is also true, but the field I work in, which is violent conflicts and mediations and so forth in a lot of conflicts around the world, I can tell you charity is not persuasive. People are hard-hearted. You have to talk to them about interests, and you have to talk about what works, because that's going to be persuasive, and their interest has got to be something about enlightened self-interest. It's got to work for them and work for others. And the problem is, you know, if we go back to Virginia Leary and the International Labor Organization, when was it created? It was created in the Treaty of Versailles. Why the Treaty of Versailles? Because we knew at that point that injustice with regard to employment was a generator of violent conflict. It was part of the source of the First World War, and we had to address it. So it wasn't charity. It wasn't be nice to the workers. Let's redistribute the funds a bit better. It was, we can't afford the violent conflict there. So this kind of engaging in this and being, I forget how you phrased it, but informed and deliberative. This is right, which also implies participatory, because we're not going to be well informed without it. On the idea of equality, we often forget, and here I'm more of a positivist international jurist. So I would read the UN Charter, and you know it's pretty quiet on human rights, Article 1, Article 55. But if you read a couple of things it does talk about, discrimination and equality, it also talks about in Article 55, well-being. The duty of the state is not to be generous in the distribution of human rights. It's actually to use its authority. In fact, it's legal responsibility. It's a basis of its own sovereignty, is that it has a duty to cooperate, by the way, also with other states in Article 1 of the Charter, duty of cooperation, but to deliver the well-being of persons within the state. That's an idea that's not just about a human rights paradigm. It's not just a rights, duties, a vertical notion. It's something about a collective quality of life and progress and so forth. I want to come back to money. So in our country, here in Canada, do you remember the debates with Justin Trudeau and Harper and who was the NDP representative from Montreal? Get his name now. Commentator. We forget very quickly the politicians. And there was a debate, and they were talking about, you know, well, would someone run a deficit? And of course, Trudeau said, yeah, we'll happily run a deficit, right? We're going to run 10 or 20 billion, he said. Eventually, we run lots of multi-billion-dollar deficits now. But then COVID came, and our country, where we keep telling us we don't have money, we can't fix a housing problem, we've got 250,000 people homeless in this country. Outside the doors, you will see. This is a lived reality we can't easily escape. But what did we do? In 18 months after COVID, we added $250 million to our debt. And actually, in the last few years, we're now doubling. We're up to $1 trillion, almost to $900 billion Canadian debt. We doubled our collective debt. Did our currency drop? All the things we were told about? Are we suddenly impoverished? No, we're actually told in the G7, we have the lowest relative percent of debt to GDP or GNI. Apparently, we could afford it. So why the heck didn't we spend $500 billion earlier to deal with homelessness and health issues and so forth? It's not a money problem, people. This is what I want to tell you. It's not a money problem. That fiction about, you know, our national budget, it's the same like your home budget. Do you have a printing press at home? I don't. My household budget is not the same as a state budget. Oh, they come up with fancy words, quantitative easing. They're printing money. That's what they're doing. So we actually can do it. And you're right. We have more money in the world. What is money? Money is basically a container of accumulated value. We have massive accumulated global value. The question is, how do we use it? How do we deploy it? What do we? This is a question of power. And power is, I think, the central thing, which is really crucial to your work and analysis here. Who decides is a question of power. who suffers and who benefits, question of power. This, I think, is, really essential for us if we want to actually seek the improvement of well-being in society and in global society. A couple of other quick points about the way that we've been approaching this. I know you talk about the MDGs and the SDGs. If you looked at one area that I've worked in for many, many years is, and I know you worked with the Center for Economic and Social Rights, but I work more on the cultural, language, minorities, because they correlate highly. Half of all violent conflicts in the world are self-determination disputes, and about 90% of all violent conflicts in the world are minority, majority, or inter-community disputes. The MDGs, if you did a quick correlation or even put in your computer minority MDGs, you wouldn't get a correlation. Minorities were silent. So Tunisia was a poster child of the MDGs. But if you dug into Tunisia, you suddenly discover there's a remarkable inequality within Tunisia, because they were looking at aggregate progress. They didn't look at disaggregate progress. The lawyers and the jurists make this nonsensical argument about justiciability, which you raised. This is a nonsense and a fiction, and forgive me for saying, a little bit of an American preoccupation. I remember many, many years ago, early 1990s, I think it was, the American Society of International Law sponsored a kind of written debate between Anthony D'Amato at the time at Northwestern University, major scholar, member of the American Society of International Law. Errol, you'll remember Professor D'Amato, and wrote a lot about treaty law and so forth. And he wrote this piece, defending economic and social rights. They didn't even mention cultural rights, are non-justiciable because they're just policy aspirations, not real stuff. But civil and political rights, that's the real stuff. And that's where we adjudicate. And an old friend of mine, probably the most prolific writer in housing rights, Scott Leckie, wrote the counterpoint. He said, of course they're justiciable. Scott's also an American, as was Anthony D'Amato. He said, what do you mean they're not justiciable? One of the key decisions of American adjudicated history is Brown versus Board of Education. It's a god-darn education dispute. Never worked in labor law. Of course it's justiciable. But in our country, if you look at our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a strange, by international comparative terms, quarter or so of the provision of the Charter talk about language. In most constitutions, it's a single provision. We got a big chunk of them. And I can tell you language rights are justiciable in Canada, right? So the idea that language, culture, housing, education, health are non-justiciable, nonsense, just pure nonsense. Most of the rest of the world has adjudicated these things regularly. I also sit on the board with Errol, actually, of Human Rights Watch Canada. And Human Rights Watch for many, many years, argued this idea. The real rights were civil and political rights. It took them a long time. I remember I was in New York, but Ari Nair suddenly had an epiphany, former longtime executive director of Human Rights Watch. And he suddenly had an epiphany because it was in the context of Nargis, the cyclone in Nargis in the Bay of Bengal. And he said, oh, well, this is clearly a violation of what? The right to health. The Myanmar government did not permit any international organizations to assist with addressing the hundreds of thousands probably millions who were displaced, hundreds of thousands. We don't know because they didn't allow participation. Ari went even further. He said it's not only a violation of the right to health, it's probably an international crime. So, okay, wow, this is going very far. Suddenly, Human Rights Watch starts having more work around health. But Ken Roth, who was a prosecutor, I think in Chicago, wherever he was before he became deputy executive director and longtime executive director, also followed this for years, was completely against the idea that cultural rights could ever be real rights or adjudicated. So I think this idea, which was then focused a lot around this methodology of shame, which you mentioned also. Shame ain't gonna do it. We're living in an increasingly shameless world, first of all. But second of all, if you're relying on shame, you're not gonna get the outcomes we're looking for. So, we really have to turn this around. And I would just say that there is abundant evidence to show that not only are these subject matters capable of adjudication, but they're often the best way to be addressed because they may give standing, they may give voice to those who are affected, and so forth. I wanted to just draw on something you wrote, which I thought was very interesting in Open Global Rights, for those of you who know that Professor Iliaman has written quite a bit and been very engaged in Open Global Rights for many years. And you wrote, it wasn't so much a nice comment when Professor Farmer died, Dr. Farmer died. But I want to go over, you drew out 6 points for us. This is in a text of about a year and a half ago. And you call them 6 lessons from Paul Farmer's work. And I'll just go over them quickly. So the first was, there's a moral basis of the right to health and its implications. And I'm going to summarize that by simply saying the argument obviously you affirm here, is that norms matter. So first lesson is norms matter. There are things, rights, whether they are natural or whether they're more positivist, they not only exist, they matter. And this is rooted in value and therefore dignity and therefore indignity. So lesson 1, norms matter. Lesson 2, inequality is the problem, not just poverty. And that's already a question of justice, right? And here, a notion of justice, distributive justice, or fairness, we could say. Who suffers, who benefits, what are the conditions, and so forth. And we have to simply reject the idea, which you argue, it's not possible, it's not plausible, nothing we can do, nature decides, all these kind of nonsenses. As you pointed out in your presentation, in the last couple of years under COVID, in the sudden creation of scores or hundreds of billionaires, well, hundreds of millions of people suffered. Third point, reclaiming the role of the state and public services. And we have been living in this liberal idea, get the state out of the way. I remember Julius Nyerere, former president of Tanzania, arguing vociferously about how structural adjustment basically destroyed Tanzania and condemned an enormous number of people. You had these economists at the World Bank come to Africa and say, you got to stop planting food and everything, plant cotton because it grows well here. And then you can sell it on the market and you can have more money and import food. Well, what did they do? They planted cotton. Suddenly there was too much cotton. The price of cotton went down. They'd gotten rid of all their food production. They had to import all their food and they didn't even have enough money to pay for the importation of the food. It impoverished them. And then, you know what? Turns out that cotton production destroys the soil. The soil. Well, maybe it destroys the soil. Also, the soil, and so it's just literally destroying the land. Stupid economists at the World Bank telling you what to do, right? But the point here about the state and public services, the state matters too, but how the state conducts itself, this idea of the responsible state, not an extractive state, not a deal amongst elites as part of an international system. And you link that in the spirit of Paul Farmer with clinical care. The fourth point is focusing on the conditions for effective enjoyment of health rights. And so this is something about the practicalities, on the ground realities, but also not just the state as a regulatory, but the idea of public interest and the state as an actor. And a responsible state also to its citizenry and so forth. The concept of sovereignty here not being the sovereign, the king, but the idea of a democratic state. The sovereign is the people, popular and democratic sovereignty. Fifth point, evidence, expertise, and truth claims. And you mentioned this again. And I'll summarize it just by saying science matters. And I would add another adjunct to that. We can and we must think before we act. But the science here is that it's got to be grounded, right? Not just theories. It's got to be informed by those who are affected. It's got to work for those who are affected. And one has to keep our eyes on the outcome. And the final point that you addressed is that accompaniment and pragmatic solidarity. walking the talk. We must do. And doing, by the way, or we are as we do or as we act, is the essence of this. And I loved the idea, yeah, I'd never heard this before. You quoted, I don't know who he is actually, Rudolf Virchow, father of social medicine. I'm not from the health sphere, so some of you probably know. But that the physicians are the attorneys of the poor. That is a wonderful idea. And I think if we can think about that, I would say in terms of human rights advocates more generally. And you concluded there with a personal quote. I noticed that you quote periodically from Camus, and I like Camus too. I like the existentialists generally, but you also you make reference to Sisyphus, which of course is not Camus, but his book about the myth of Sisyphus. Because we often get very down, right? We're overwhelmed by the challenges. It seems impossible. But here you argue that the antidote to burnout is caring more and finding others with whom to care. And I think that's crucial. And I tell my students, I don't know how we're going to solve these problems, but maybe we can be part of the solution and we can be part of it together. Thank you for inspiring us.
Thank you very much, Professor Yemen, for a fabulous presentation, and thanks, John, for your comments. The graphs that you showed really made me very sad on this anniversary of both the WHO and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And to me, it tells me a tale of mass rank hypocrisy by the leaders of the world, because for two things. I had the privilege of knowing John Humphreys before he died. And one of the things that he shocked me was he said, people don't know that at the time that he and Eleanor Roosevelt was drafting the declaration, the Secretary of State of the US at the time was telling them, dumb it down, because don't expect this to be something we're going to take seriously, because they didn't really want, especially the economic and social rights. So number one, how do we deal with hypocrisy that you can see all the way going to what you call the chains of history? And then when you move to the Bretton Woods Institute, which you mentioned, again, a rank hypocrisy element. They happened when prior to the WHO, the World Trade Organization, ever being established, there was a commitment by the US to establish the International Trade Organization, which included all the things you mentioned, such as labor rights, such as the rising of living standards and promoting equality within the global economic stream. What happened? And even though the US had promoted it, once the Havana Charter was established, they refused to ratify it and it died. So my question to you is, given the fact that as you go through the history, there's rank hypocrisy going all the way to the present day, how does one deal with that? Maybe you in the final part of your presentation, you offered suggestions that don't rely on the leaders, rely on the people, and how to deal with that hypocrisy. But then ultimately, it also, especially the one where you showed the disparities that are happening between the extremely wealthy and the poor. The only solution that I think as anyone has suggested to deal with that is something which the economist Thomas Piketty said. The root of all of that is the fact that those who have capital essentially become richer and those who don't become poorer. That is such a wicked problem that some people say there's no solution to that. I do think there is a solution, not communism, but perhaps massive redistribution through taxation. But these are all the issues which are so enormous to everything you said. Unless the solution is, I wonder whether we're going to be continuing with the rank hypocrisy trend towards modern history. So maybe, John, you can talk about that too. Sorry.
Well, son? Oh, so I share your frustration. There is a point in this book where I say, I am also enormously frustrated by the potentially slow rate of change or the ineffectualness of different strategies. And why don't we just have a revolution? But I do think that human rights preserves protections for people, and that revolutions haven't turned out, I'm very familiar with the history in Latin America, have not turned out as we might have liked in other places in the world. But I fully agree with you. I think that for the students who are now embarking upon this, who want to be practitioners as well as maybe ivory tower professors, this is going to be a tough road, right? You are going to certainly lose cases. You're going to, I describe losing clients killed in the most brutal fashions. You're going to lose friends and colleagues to violence. You are going to rail against that very hypocrisy that you see in full flower in the WHO and at many international conferences and among scholars too. And you're going to feel deep, deep impotence to be able to change anything. And the only antidote that I have found to that is what John alluded to, which is working collectively with people who care just as much. And all of the organizing Partners in Health has an engaged team that does outreach and lobbying. All of the coalitions that we work in are not only important to being able to make iterative, yes, absolutely iterative progress, but also to maintain our resolve against nihilism and against cynicism, because that's what the status quo depends upon our surrendering to that. So, you know, what I would recommend is joining collectively. And then by that, I don't mean jointly signing a law review article, right? I mean, actually getting organized and engaged, whether it's on the political front in Canada or elsewhere, and work across movements and research networks. Just as John eloquently stated, and I tried to formulate at the beginning, all of these are part of the same puzzle of extractivism, financial extractivism, labor extractivism, women who are unpaid in a care economy so that their people in the formal sector can be paid less, extractivism of knowledge and even pathogens, right, in intellectual property, of fossil fuels and environment. It's all one really destructive vision, and we need to work together collectively, organize coalitions to fight back against that. Am I despondent or nihilistic? No, because we've been in really difficult places before. I mean, Argentina under the civic military dictatorship, pretty horrific. South Africa under apartheid, pretty horrific. Times when we thought that the nuclear proliferation would never end. When we had legal segregation in the United States, we are capable of making progress when we organize and work collectively. And I believe that the levers, and this is what I've identified in our Partners in Health economic justice agenda, are tax, radical tax transformation, because that's when we saw when there were major investments in public education, when tax rates were high in countries across the global north, and there were major investments in education and health care, et cetera, that's when we saw human flourishing go up. And that's what all changed at the end of the 1970s. We can go back. This reality has been created in a very deliberate fashion, but when we begin to reject it, when we decolonize our imaginations, we can write a different story. I do believe that.
Other questions or comments? Yep, please go ahead. Sorry, I don't know your name. Could you?
Lisa Foreman from the University of Toronto.
I haven't seen you in so long.
Thank you so much, both of you, for truly inspiring comments. My head is really spinning with it. Ellie, I wanted to ask you to substantiate more your assertion about the instability of the right to health. Because, I mean, in some sense, you'd want rights to be unstable to some extent to respond to social change. So do you think that the instability is a problem? And what do you think is the solution? If it is a problem, what is the solution to that instability?
I think it's only a problem if we don't have the institutions with which to manage that instability. So really effective mechanisms of participation, fair financing, et cetera. So, for example, why is it unstable? It can be unstable for positive reasons. So I'm meeting on Tuesday with the Colombian Ministry of Health and about abortion in Colombia. In the court in 2022 decriminalized abortion through 24 weeks. And previously in 2006, it had decriminalized abortion in 3 instances. And that shows some instability of why would, as in Spanish we call la cosa juzgada, change over that period of time. Well, it changes because of changing techniques, the far greater ability for people to get a hold of misoprostol, for example, changing structures in the Colombian health system per se, but also changing norms. And that's why the international norms and the national development of Colombian jurisprudence together have made it so that there is, in effect, a different set of circumstances for the Colombian Constitutional Court to adjudge what are the possibilities for framing this right. And that happens negatively too, as we saw, you know, in many cases around the world. So I think that it's not a problem unless we expect to be able to use General Comment 14 in an unchanging way and decode it down to health systems. Does that answer the question? We can talk about it more. Lisa is a global expert on this.
The questions? Please, back over here.
This isn't really a question, it's a comment. Craig Phillips, professor in nursing here at the University of Ottawa. Yaman, thank you so much for your presentation. And please send my regards to Dr. Davis, Sheila Davis at
Yes.
Partners in Health, longtime friend and incredible mentor and colleague of mine, as I'm sure you have tremendous respect for her. My comment
We share
is,
poetry.
Yeah.
Sheila's a big poet. Yeah,
she's amazing.
she's amazing.
Definitely. And my comment is really to you, John, and it's to ask you about one of the points that you mentioned about the physicians being the attorneys for impoverished peoples. I actually encourage you to reconceptualize that somewhat and look more broadly to the other members of the health systems. In a context of Professor Jiaman's book, where we're talking about decolonizing, our health systems critically need to be decolonized. That conceptualization as the physician, as the leader, does not actually translate to much of the world, where in many parts of the world, people do not even encounter nurses like myself. We need to really think differently and more broadly about what roles various different formally trained healthcare providers bring to the table, but also some of the folks like the curanderos in various parts of Latin America, doulas who provide incredible resources in many parts of the world for maternal child health. Thank you for listening and thank you for considering, and I look forward to speaking with both of you later on as well.
Let me jump in and quickly say, you don't have to persuade me on that at all. I totally 100% agree with you. First of all, I was quoting exactly because I'd never heard the phrase before. So of course, Alicia can explain it. What I believe, my understanding of it, was to say that, you know, there's a tendency for each of us to think maybe we're a cog in a wheel, we're a piece of an instrument and so forth. But on the ground, you know, we have to be advocates. We have to be, there's more than just the technical practical function, right? And the notion of care. And I would certainly say one of the insights that we're getting increasingly as we include within the law school, for example, and I don't know if you know much about this, Alicia, but the calls to action of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, but some of them were addressed, a number were addressed to the university, but some specifically to the law schools. But part of this is a change of paradigm and the way we approach. So, law in most societies is an instrument of establishment, and it is also partially extractive. That's what, maybe we don't like to think about it, but that's what actually a lot of lawyers are doing. And the system often does. But if we reconceptualize it and we think, and Indigenous worldviews help us, because they start to talk about, and by the way, it's not just Indigenous in the saltwater divide. I work lots of tribal groups in Africa, Middle East, and elsewhere, and their notion of their responsibility is one of stewardship and care. And so this idea that we are part of, but they may be in particular positions. I've been with sheikhs in southern Iraq or Yemen crying because not of the suffering as such, but their sense of failure to be able to be fully stewards in the care of their community and so forth. This is a different idea, a different ethos than we have normally had, for example, in law school. But that's my understanding. I took an inspiration from it, and I loved. I didn't know it before.
So Rudolf Virchow was the father of social medicine, and he wrote that after the typhus epidemic in Silesia, and his view was that doctors cannot be technicians, prescribing medicines, but the doctors that physical health is a reflection of social health, right? So, and this is actually a quote that Paul, whom I adored, and we were very close for decades, and I would debate about, because he would quote this, physicians are the attorneys of the poor, and I would say, well, there are attorneys of the poor as well. So it was sort of a back and forth thing between us, which I included in this remembrance of him. But I absolutely take the point. I have learned a lot from working with Indigenous people in Latin America. As well, frankly, I'm on the Lancet Commission on Arctic and Northern Health, and have learned just an absolute tremendous amount about how our narrow biomedical view of health is so restricted and so not the only way to understand health. And I think Paul's view of social medicine was also much more capacious. And it's certainly something that we follow at Partners in Health. We have regular social medicine trainings and teach-ins. My view of law is, and I say this from the very beginning of the book, this is a book, the texture of this story is one of struggle, right? Law offers an inherently conservative set of tools. And I quote Audre Lorde's famous, it's using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, which she thinks is impossible. But I say it's an ongoing struggle, right? We are not going to convince everyone of this, going back to the cynicism and hypocrisy. But this is a struggle for those of you who are young that will define your lives and the world your children will inhabit. And it has never been more important to come together and work together toward a non-extractivist vision of the world. So I, invite you all to see what we're doing at Partners in Health, and I am happy to talk to anybody who's interested in this challenge.
I just add a point about, this is a perpetual dilemma. If you want to be part of the solution, how much are you inside the beast? So do you have to learn the techniques, as you said, to dismantle the master's house? Well, yes, you do, because power really exists. If you traveled here, I don't know how specifically, but I'm assuming you flew and you probably had to present a passport or something. There's like some serious hard power things going on there, right? Control of frontiers and all the rest of it. Freedom, freedom of movement is a human right, right? No, not really, right? I mean, we control tremendously movement. So you have to think, okay, how can we contest in a struggle? And you know, the law is an instrument of contestation also. And this is, go back to something Errol mentioned, you know, but John Humphrey. John Humphreys was not a Canadian government official. He was a UN official. He was an independent guy. And it's very funny that our government likes to claim credit for him. The truth is, the government of Canada voted against every draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights until the final draft. And they tried like heck to diminish it, water it down, and so forth, because their view at the point was human rights is going to undermine the Cold War, the war with the communists and Soviets. This idea that, you know, Canada, there's a long legacy of, excuse me, you know, not the case, right? And never mind Indigenous realities and all the rest of it. But we need to have people who can contest this, challenge it.